There are moments when the world cracks open, when the thin membrane separating the ordinary from the impossible tears just enough to let something through. These moments do not announce themselves with trumpets or fanfare. They arrive in static on a television screen at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. They arrive in a 72-second burst of radio noise from the direction of a constellation no one was watching. They arrive in the silent passage of lights across an Arizona sky, in the gravelly voice of a dead man speaking through the throat of an 11-year-old girl, in the sudden emptiness of a village where the cooking fires are still burning but no one remains to tend them. These are the intrusions, the broadcast signals we never authorized, the transmissions we cannot explain, the moments when something breaks through the noise of daily life and reminds us that the universe is far stranger, far older, and far less understood than we have been led to believe. What you are about to hear is not a collection of ghost stories or urban legends dressed up for entertainment. These are documented events, investigated by federal agencies, photographed by military technicians, witnessed by thousands, recorded on tape and committed to official reports that gather dust in archives across the world. These are the cases that refuse to close, the questions that refuse to resolve, the signals that came from somewhere and left us with nothing but the echo of their passage. We begin not with ancient mysteries or distant lands, but with something far more intimate, something that invaded the one space Americans believed was completely under control, their living rooms. The year was 1987, the place was Chicago, and for approximately 90 seconds, something took over the airwaves that no one has ever been able to identify or explain. The date was November 22nd, a Sunday night, and across the Chicago metropolitan area, families were settling into their evening routines. Some were watching the news, others were tuned to Doctor Who on public television. The signals beaming into their homes came from towers on top of the Sears Tower and the John Hancock Center, powerful transmitters designed to reach millions of viewers across northern Illinois and into Indiana and Wisconsin. These were not small operations. WGN-TV and WTTW were major broadcast stations, their signals protected by federal law and backed by the full authority of the Federal Communications Commission. To interfere with a broadcast signal was a federal crime, and to actually override one, to replace the legitimate transmission with your own, required equipment and knowledge that put such an act beyond the reach of all but the most sophisticated operators. At 9:14 in the evening, viewers watching the WGN 9 o'clock news saw something impossible. The screen flickered. The image of sports anchor Dan Roan dissolved into static, and then, from the chaos of interference, a figure emerged. He was wearing a mask, a distorted latex representation of Max Headroom, the computer-generated character who had become a cultural phenomenon in the mid-80s, a glitching, stuttering artificial intelligence who appeared in music videos and Coca-Cola commercials. But this was not the real Max Headroom. This was something else entirely. The figure swayed in front of a spinning sheet of corrugated metal, the kind you might find on the side of a shed or a warehouse, rotating slowly to create a crude approximation of the geometric backgrounds used in the official Max Headroom broadcasts. The lighting was harsh and flat. The image quality was degraded, jumping and rolling as if the transmission itself was unstable, and the figure, whoever was behind that rubber mask, said nothing coherent. He laughed, he hummed. He made sounds that might have been words but collapsed into gibberish before they could form meaning. And then he was gone. The whole intrusion lasted less than 30 seconds. WGN engineers scrambled to identify the source of the interference and switched to a backup transmission link. Dan Roan returned to the screen, visibly confused, and finished his sportscast. The station received calls from viewers asking what had just happened. No one had an answer, but the hijacker was not finished. 2 hours later, at 11:15, WTW was broadcasting an episode of Doctor Who. This was public television, a different frequency, a different transmission tower, different equipment entirely. And yet, as viewers watched the Doctor navigate an alien planet, the screen flickered again. The same figure appeared, the same mask, the same spinning metal background. But this time the intrusion lasted longer, approximately 90 seconds, and the content became stranger, more disturbing, and more deliberately provocative. The masked figure spoke this time, though his words remained largely incomprehensible. He referenced the WGN sportscaster by name, suggesting he was aware of the earlier hijacking. He held up a Pepsi can and threw it away, perhaps mocking the Coca-Cola commercials that the real Max Headroom had appeared in. He made obscene gestures, he sang fragments of songs, and then, in the final moments of the transmission, the figure bent over, pulled down his pants, and was spanked with a fly swatter by an accomplice wearing French maid gloves. The image cut to black. Doctor Who resumed. The Federal Communications Commission launched one of the largest investigations in its history. To understand why this intrusion was so significant, one must understand what it would have taken to accomplish. Broadcast signals from major television stations are not like radio waves from a ham operator in a basement. They are powerful, directional, and transmitted from some of the highest points in any metropolitan area. To override such a signal, a hijacker would need to transmit their own signal at a higher power level than the legitimate broadcast, pointed at the receiving antennas of the local cable systems and home television sets. This would require a substantial transmitter, a large antenna, a clear line of sight to the target area, and intimate knowledge of the frequencies and technical specifications of the stations being attacked. The hijacker would also need to do this twice, on 2 different frequencies, without being detected by the Federal Communications Commission's monitoring equipment, or the station's own engineers. Investigators fanned out across Chicago. They examined rooftops and abandoned buildings. They interviewed broadcast engineers and amateur radio enthusiasts. They traced the likely geographic origin of the signal to somewhere in the northern suburbs. But the area was large and the equipment used could have been mobile. Every lead ended in a dead end. Every suspect was cleared. The video itself offered few clues. The location appeared to be a basement or garage. The corrugated metal background was common and untraceable. The mask was a commercially available Max Headroom costume. The accomplice's gloves could have been purchased anywhere. The voices were distorted and muffled. What investigators did determine was that the perpetrators had significant technical expertise. This was not the work of teenagers with a CB radio. Whoever did this understood broadcast engineering at a professional level. They had access to equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars. They had scouted their transmission locations and timed their attacks to moments when they were least likely to be immediately traced. And they had vanished completely, leaving nothing behind but 90 seconds of footage that would become one of the most analysed videos in the history of American broadcasting. Nearly 4 decades later, no one has ever been charged. The original footage still exists. It has been uploaded, copied, enhanced, analysed frame by frame by amateur investigators and professional journalists alike. Every few years, someone claims to have identified the hijacker, a former broadcast engineer, a disgruntled employee, a member of a local hacker group, but no identification has ever been confirmed. The individuals behind the masks, if they are still alive, have kept their secret for more than 35 years. What makes this case so enduring is not merely its technical audacity but its fundamental strangeness. The hijackers did not use their access to broadcast a political message or a bomb threat, or any of the things that authorities feared when they realised someone had learned to override television signals. They broadcast nonsense. They spanked themselves with a fly swatter. They laughed into the void and disappeared. Were they performance artists making a statement about the fragility of the systems we trust? Were they technical hobbyists proving that the impossible could be done? Were they something else entirely, motivated by impulses we cannot begin to understand? The signal came from somewhere. It was real. It was witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people in their own homes, on a Sunday night when they expected nothing more than the evening news and an episode of Doctor Who. And then it was gone, leaving behind only questions. But signals have a way of arriving uninvited, and some come from much farther away than Chicago. On August 15th, 1977, in a field outside Delaware, Ohio, a radio telescope called Big Ear was listening to the stars. Big Ear was not a conventional dish. It was a flat rectangular array the size of 3 football fields, part of Ohio State University's search for extraterrestrial intelligence program. Every night, as the Earth rotated, the telescope scanned a narrow strip of sky, recording the intensity of radio waves at a frequency near 1420 megahertz, the frequency at which hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, naturally emits radiation. This was considered the most likely frequency for any extraterrestrial civilization to use for communication, the so-called water hole where intelligent beings might be listening for each other across the cosmic void. The telescope generated reams of printout data, columns of numbers and letters representing the strength of received signals over time. Most of it was noise, the random static of a universe full of stars and radiation. Occasionally there were spikes from Earth-based interference, satellites, or known celestial objects. The job of analysing this data was tedious and repetitive, the kind of work that made you doubt whether anything meaningful would ever appear. Jerry Amon was a volunteer astronomer, a professor at Franklin University who donated his time to the SETI program because he believed the question of whether humanity was alone in the universe was worth asking. On August 18th, 3 days after the observation was made, Amon was reviewing the printout from the night of the 15th. He worked methodically, scanning the columns of characters, looking for anything unusual, and then he saw it. The printout used a simple alphanumeric code to represent signal intensity. Numbers 1 through 9 represented the lowest intensities. When signals exceeded 9, the system switched to letters. A represented 10, B represented 11, and so on. In all the years of Big Ear's operation, signals rarely exceeded a few digits. The background noise of the universe was relatively quiet at this frequency. What Amon saw on the printout was a sequence that read 6E-C-Q-U-J5. The U represented a signal intensity of 30, the strongest signal ever recorded by the telescope, more than 30 times louder than the background noise of deep space. The sequence showed a signal that rose sharply over the course of 37 seconds, peaked at that extraordinary intensity, and then faded over another 35 seconds. The total duration was approximately 72 seconds, exactly the amount of time Big Ear's beam would remain fixed on a single point in the sky as the Earth rotated. This was precisely the profile that would be expected from a signal originating in deep space, from a source that was fixed in position and did not move with the Earth. If the signal had been from a terrestrial source, an airplane, a satellite, a microwave transmitter, it would not have exhibited this precise pattern. It would have moved, fluctuated, or repeated. This signal did none of those things. Amon circled the sequence on the printout and wrote a single word in red ink in the margin. Wow. The wow. Signal, as it would come to be known, came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, from a region of sky that contained no known radio sources, no pulsars, no quasars, nothing that should have been transmitting at that frequency and that intensity. It occurred at 1420.456 MHz, within the protected band set aside internationally for hydrogen line observations, a band where human transmitters are forbidden by international agreement. In the weeks and months that followed, Big Ear was pointed back at the same coordinates again and again. Other radio telescopes around the world joined the search. The signal was never detected again. Astronomers proposed explanations. Perhaps it was a secret military satellite, its existence classified and its frequency deliberately chosen to mimic an extraterrestrial signal. This theory collapsed when no such satellite was ever identified, and the precise characteristics of the signal did not match any known satellite transmission profile. Perhaps it was reflection of Earth-based radio signals off a piece of space debris, but the intensity and spectral purity of the signal ruled out such reflections. Perhaps it was a comet surrounded by a cloud of hydrogen that might produce a radio signature at the waterhole frequency. A researcher named Antonio Paris proposed this theory in 2017, identifying 2 comets that had passed through the region of sky where the signal originated. But subsequent analysis showed that the comets were not in the correct position on August 15th, that their hydrogen signatures would have been far too weak to produce the observed intensity, and that no similar signal had ever been detected from any comet before or since. Every natural explanation has been systematically eliminated. What remains is a 72-second burst of radio energy, perfectly matching the theoretical profile of an extraterrestrial beacon, coming from a region of empty space in the direction of the galactic center, recorded once and never repeated. The original printout still exists. It is housed in the Ohio History Connection archives, the paper yellowed with age, the red ink of Eamon's exclamation still visible in the margin. It is perhaps the closest thing humanity possesses to physical evidence of a signal from somewhere else. Jerry Amon died in 2022, having spent 45 years considering what he had found that night. He never claimed to know what the signal was. He only knew what it was not. It was not noise. It was not interference. It was not a known natural phenomenon. It was something that arrived uninvited, lasted just long enough to be recorded, and then vanished into the silence from which it had come. Some signals come from the depths of space. Others drift across the sky, low and slow, blocking out the stars as they pass. The evening of March 13th, 1997, was clear and warm across the state of Arizona. The kind of evening when people sit on their porches and look up at the sky simply because it is beautiful. The kind of evening when thousands of witnesses are already watching when something impossible appears. The first reports came from the northern part of the state near Henderson, Nevada, just after 7 o'clock. A man described seeing a V-shaped formation of lights moving south. Then more reports came from Paulden, Arizona, then Prescott, then Phoenix, then Tucson. The formation was moving slowly, silently, following the spine of the state from north to south, and everywhere it passed, people stopped what they were doing and stared. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Witnesses described 5 to 7 lights arranged in a boomerang or chevron pattern, the distance between the lights suggesting an object of enormous size. Estimates range from the length of a football field to over a mile wide. The formation moved at a leisurely pace, perhaps 30 to 40 miles per hour, far too slow for any conventional aircraft, and it made no sound. Witnesses standing directly beneath it reported absolute silence. Tim Lee was driving home with his family near Phoenix when they saw the lights. He pulled over to watch. He later described the object as so large that it filled his entire field of vision from one horizon to the other. He could see stars on either side of it, but where the object passed, the stars disappeared, blocked by something solid and dark. Michael Kirsten was a commercial airline pilot with thousands of hours of flight experience. He watched the formation pass over his home in Tempe, and later stated that it was unlike anything he had ever seen in his career. The size, the silence, the impossibly slow speed, none of it matched any aircraft he knew. Fife Symington was the governor of Arizona. In the days following the event, he held a press conference in which he appeared to mock the sightings, introducing a member of his staff dressed in an alien costume to general laughter. The message was clear. The state's highest elected official did not take the report seriously, but years later Symington told a different story. In 2007, at a press conference organised by former pilots and government officials who had witnessed unexplained aerial phenomena, Symington admitted that he had seen the object himself. He described it as enormous, silent, and utterly unlike anything of human origin. He said he had mocked the sightings publicly because he did not want to cause panic and did not know what else to do, but privately he had been as shaken as any of the thousands of other witnesses. The Air Force eventually issued an explanation. They claimed that the lights seen around 10 o'clock that night were flares dropped during a training exercise at the Barry Goldwater Range south of Phoenix. This explanation was immediately challenged by witnesses who pointed out that the structured craft had been seen hours earlier, beginning around 8 o'clock, and that flares do not move in formation across hundreds of miles of territory before gently descending to Earth. Dozens of home videos were recorded that night. They show lights hanging in the sky, drifting, flickering. But amateur video equipment in 1997 could not capture what witnesses reported seeing with their own eyes. The dark mass between the lights, the solid structure that blocked the stars, the sense of something massive passing overhead in absolute silence. Dr. Lynn Kite was a Phoenix physician who had been photographing unusual lights in the sky above her home for months before the March event. Her footage and photographs would later be compiled into a documentary. She described the lights she saw that night as a kind of amber orbs, perfectly spaced, moving with deliberate coordination. She did not know what they were. She only knew they were not flares, not helicopters, not aircraft. They were something else. The Phoenix lights remain one of the most witnessed unidentified aerial phenomena in American history. The witnesses numbered in the thousands. They included police officers, pilots, military veterans, scientists, and the sitting governor of a state. The event was captured on video, logged in police reports, and covered by national news media. And yet, nearly 3 decades later, there is no consensus on what moved across Arizona that night. Some signals arrive from the sky. Others emerge from inside the walls of an ordinary house. In August of 1977, in a modest council house at 284 Green Street in the Enfield district of North London, something began to knock. Peggy Hodgson was a single mother raising 4 children. Her home was small, crowded, and unremarkable. The kind of house that blends into its surroundings and does not attract attention. But in the summer of that year, attention found the Hodgson family whether they wanted it or not. It started with the beds. Peggy's daughters, Janet, aged 11, and Margaret, aged 13, reported that their beds were shaking at night. At first, Peggy assumed they were making it up, seeking attention or playing some kind of prank. But then the knocking started. It came from inside the walls, rhythmic and insistent, moving from room to room. Peggy checked the pipes, the radiators, the furniture. She found no explanation. Then the furniture began to move. On the evening of August 31st, Peggy watched a chest of drawers slide across the floor of her daughter's bedroom, apparently of its own accord. She tried to push it back. It resisted her, then moved again when she released it. She called the neighbours, she called the police. 2 officers responded to the call. They entered the house expecting to find a simple domestic disturbance, or perhaps evidence of a prank. What they found instead would later be documented in official police reports. Constable Carolyn Heaps witnessed a chair move across the kitchen floor without anyone touching it. She attempted to investigate but could find no strings, no wires, no mechanical explanation. The officers stayed for several hours. The knocking continued. The furniture continued to move. When they left, they filed a report stating that they had witnessed unexplained phenomena but could offer no official explanation. Word spread quickly. By September, the Enfield house had become the focus of intense media and investigative interest. The Society for Psychical Research sent 2 of its most experienced investigators, Maurice Gross and Gillian Playfair, to document the case. They would spend the next 18 months observing, recording, and attempting to understand what was happening inside the Hodgson home. What they documented defied easy explanation. Objects moved without visible cause. Toys were thrown across rooms with force. Heavy furniture shifted position when no one was near it. Investigators set up cameras and audio equipment to capture evidence, and they succeeded. Photographs showed objects in mid-flight, chairs tipped at impossible angles, children levitating above their beds. But the most disturbing phenomenon centered on Janet. The 11-year-old began to speak in voices that did not belong to her. The most frequent was a deep, rasping growl that identified itself as Bill. This voice claimed to be an elderly man who had lived and died in the house decades earlier. It spoke of details from Bill's life, his occupation, the circumstances of his death, the chair in which he had died, that were later verified through public records and interviews with neighbours who had known the man. Medical professionals examined Janet's throat. They concluded that the deep adult male voice she produced was emerging from her false vocal cords, a nearly impossible physiological feat that would cause extreme pain and damage if attempted consciously. Janet appeared to enter trance-like states during these episodes, her face distorting, her body contorting in ways that witnesses found deeply unsettling. Skeptics have proposed explanations. The girls were playing pranks, they say, and the investigators were credulous. Some evidence of trickery was indeed found. Janet was caught bending spoons herself on one occasion, and both girls admitted to faking phenomena when investigators were not present. But Gross and Playfair distinguished between the admitted hoaxes, which they attributed to the stress of constant observation, and the phenomena they witnessed firsthand under controlled conditions. Not everything could be explained by mischievous children. Audio recordings of the sessions still exist. They capture the voice of Bill speaking through Janet, a guttural rasp describing the circumstances of his death, his body found in the corner of the very room where the investigators sat. The recordings are publicly available. They remain, even decades later, profoundly unsettling to listen to. The Enfield case lasted from 1977 to 1979. Over that period, more than 30 witnesses, including police officers, journalists, photographers, BBC reporters, and skeptical investigators, reported observing phenomena they could not explain. The case was documented in thousands of photographs, hours of audio recordings, and detailed written reports that fill several volumes. When the activity finally ceased, the Hodgson family remained in the house. Janet grew up, married, had children of her own. She has spoken publicly about the case many times, consistently maintaining that the events were real, that something genuinely anomalous occurred in that house during those 18 months, something she did not understand and could not control. The house at 284 Green Street still stands. It looks like any other council house on the block. There is nothing to mark it as extraordinary. But for those who know what happened there, it remains a kind of threshold, a place where the ordinary rules of the physical world appeared to break down, where the voice of a dead man spoke through the throat of a living child, and where knocking from inside the walls continued night after night, demanding attention that no one could give and no one could refuse. Some presences announce themselves with knocks and voices. Others leave behind only absence, the silence of a place that should be full of life but is not. In November of 1930, in the remote northern reaches of Canada, a trapper named Joe LaBelle made his way through the frozen wilderness toward the shores of Lake Anjikuni. He was a seasoned traveller, familiar with the harsh rhythms of life in the subarctic, where the Inuit people had lived for generations in small fishing villages scattered along the lake shores. He had visited this particular village before, trading with its inhabitants, sharing meals, learning the routes and customs of the land. He expected nothing unusual. What he found was silence. The village was empty, not abandoned in the way a place might be if its inhabitants had packed up and moved to better fishing grounds. Empty in the way a place is when everyone simply vanishes mid-gesture, leaving everything behind. The cooking fires were still smouldering, tendrils of smoke rising into the cold air. Pots of food hung above the flames, half-cooked, as if the cooks had stepped away for only a moment. Kayaks, the most essential possession of any Inuit family, rested on the shore undisturbed. And the rifles, the precious rifles that every northern hunter depended upon for survival, leaned against doorways as if their owners had simply set them down and forgotten to pick them up again, LaBelle called out. His voice echoed across the frozen lake and returned to him unanswered. He walked through the village, entering homes, finding no signs of struggle, no signs of flight, no signs of anything except sudden and total departure. And then he found the dogs. The sled dogs were still tied to their posts. They had not been released, not fed, not watered. They had starved to death where they stood, frozen now in the November cold, their bodies testament to the passage of time since whoever had cared for them had disappeared. But it was the graves that made LaBelle's blood run cold. On the outskirts of the village, as was common practice, the Inuit had buried their dead in shallow graves marked with stones. These were sacred places, tended with care and respect. When LaBelle approached them, he saw that the stones had been disturbed, not scattered, not dug up from above as if someone had been searching for something, moved from below, pushed aside as if something within had forced its way out. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were summoned. They investigated the village, interviewed trappers and traders who had contact with its inhabitants, and attempted to reconstruct what had happened. Their official findings were inconclusive. No bodies were recovered, no witnesses came forward, no explanation was ever established. The story spread through the north, carried by fur traders and missionaries, growing stranger with each telling. Some versions claimed that the lights of the aurora borealis had flickered strangely above the village on the night of the disappearance. Others spoke of strange craft seen in the sky. Still others whispered of ancient spirits, of places where the veil between worlds grew thin and the unwary might slip through to the other side. What is certain is that approximately 30 people lived in that village on the shores of Lake Anjikuni. They hunted, fished, cooked their meals, tended their dogs, lived their lives according to rhythms unchanged for centuries, and then, on some night in November 1930, they were simply gone. The lake remains, the wilderness remains, the silence remains, unbroken by any answer to the question that Joe LaBelle asked when he first walked into that empty village and found the fires still burning. Where did they go? The question echoes across the decades, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. It joins the other questions that accumulate as we move through this territory of the unexplained. The signals that arrive from nowhere, the figures that appear on our screens uninvited, the lights that drift across our skies, the voices that speak through children who should not know the words they are saying. Some questions have answers waiting to be discovered. Others may never resolve, may simply hang in the air like the last transmission from a dying ship, like the single word scrawled in red ink on a printout from a radio telescope, like the smouldering embers of a cooking fire that no one returned to tend. The deeper we travel into this territory, the stranger the terrain becomes. What lies ahead is darker, more personal, more difficult to dismiss. The cases multiply, the evidence accumulates, the explanations grow thinner and less satisfying, and the fundamental question, what is really happening in these moments when the ordinary rules break down, remains as elusive as ever, flickering at the edge of comprehension like a signal from a distant star, like a figure in a mask swaying before a spinning metal sheet, like a voice in the dark that knows things it should not know and speaks them anyway into the silence of a house where the knocking never stops. The mountains of northeastern California rise in layered ridges, their slopes thick with ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, their peaks still holding snow deep into spring. It is country that demands respect, remote, silent, indifferent to the small dramas of human life that occasionally unfold within its shadows. In February of 1978, 5 young men vanished into this wilderness, and the circumstances of their disappearance and death remain among the most disturbing unsolved cases in American history. They were friends, these 5, Gary Mathias, Ted Wire, Bill Sterling, Jack Madruga and Jackie Hewitt. All of them lived with developmental disabilities of varying degrees. All of them had found in each other a companionship that the world did not always offer freely. They shared an enthusiasm for basketball, both playing and watching, and on the evening of February 24th they drove together to Chico State University to watch a game. They were in good spirits. The home team won. Afterward, they bought snacks at a convenience store, where a clerk later remembered them as cheerful, unremarkable, 5 friends enjoying a night out. They left the store around 10 o'clock in the evening, heading for home in Jack Madruga's turquoise Mercury Montego. The drive should have taken them southwest, back to Yuba City where their families were waiting. It was a straightforward route, well-travelled, familiar. They never arrived. 4 days later, the car was found, not on the road to Yuba City, not broken down on some logical detour. It was discovered abandoned on a remote mountain road in the Plumas National Forest, more than 70 miles in the wrong direction, at an elevation of over 4,000 feet where snow still blanketed the ground. The road they had taken led nowhere any of them had reason to go. It was not on the way to anything. It climbed into wilderness and simply ended. The car itself was undamaged. The engine was in working order. There was gas in the tank. The keys were not in the ignition, but the vehicle could have driven itself out at any time. Beside it, in the snow, investigators found footprints leading away into the forest. Not running, not stumbling, but walking. Walking deliberately, steadily, into the frozen darkness of a mountain night. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case emerged from a witness who came forward during the investigation. Joseph Shons, a local man, had been driving on that same mountain road the night the 5 men disappeared. His car had become stuck in the snow, and he had spent hours trying to free it. During that time, he reported seeing another vehicle pull up the road past him, a vehicle matching the description of Madruga's Mercury. He called out for help, but no one responded. Instead, he saw flashlights in the woods, heard voices, saw what he believed were several people moving among the trees. They seemed to be following something, or looking for something, or perhaps fleeing from something he could not see. He called out again. The lights moved away, the voices faded, and then there was only silence and the cold mountain night. Shons eventually suffered a mild heart attack from the exertion and cold. He was rescued the following morning. He told investigators what he had seen, but could not explain why 5 men would ignore his calls for help, why they would walk into the forest rather than assist a stranded motorist, why they would abandon a perfectly functional vehicle in the middle of nowhere and set off on foot into the snow. The search for the 5 men was extensive but ultimately fruitless in those early weeks. The snow was too deep, the terrain too vast, the weather too uncooperative. It was not until June, when the snows finally melted, that the first terrible discoveries were made. Ted Wire's body was found inside a Forest Service trailer roughly 19 miles from the abandoned car. The trailer was a survival shelter, stocked with provisions precisely for emergencies like this. Inside were canned goods, dehydrated food, matches, a propane heater, blankets. Everything a stranded person would need to survive the winter. Wire had been inside for an extended period. Investigators estimated weeks, possibly months. He had wrapped himself in bedsheets. He had lost nearly 80 pounds. He had developed frostbite so severe that his feet had begun to rot. And yet, he had not eaten the food. He had not lit the heater. He had not used the matches to build a fire. Everything he needed to survive was within arm's reach, and he had simply lain there, wrapped in sheets and starved to death in a cabin full of provisions. Why? What terror had so paralyzed him that he could not bring himself to open a can of beans? What had he seen? What had he experienced that left him incapable of saving his own life even when salvation was literally at his fingertips? The bodies of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found in the forest between the car and the trailer. They had collapsed in the snow, having walked miles through the freezing wilderness, and died of hypothermia. Jackie Hewitt was found nearby, his body too decomposed to determine a precise cause of death. All of them had walked the same direction, away from the car, into the mountains, toward nothing. Gary Mathias was never found. Of the 5, Mathias was the only one with military experience, the only one with training that might have helped the group survive. He was also the only one with a history of mental illness, having been diagnosed with schizophrenia after serving in the army. He was stable at the time of the disappearance, taking his medication regularly, holding down a job, causing no concern to his family or doctors. But some investigators have wondered whether something happened that night that triggered an episode, whether Mathias might have led his friends into the wilderness for reasons that made sense only in the geography of his own troubled mind. Others have proposed different theories. Perhaps they encountered someone on that mountain road, someone who threatened them, someone who chased them into the forest. Perhaps they saw something that frightened them so badly they fled on foot. Perhaps they simply made a wrong turn, became disoriented, and then compounded their mistake with a series of increasingly desperate decisions. But none of these explanations account for the totality of the evidence. None explain why they drove 70 miles in the wrong direction. None explain why they ignored Joseph Schon's calls for help. None explain why Ted Wire starved to death in a cabin full of food. And none explain what happened to Gary Mathias, whose body has never been recovered despite extensive searches, whose fate remains unknown nearly 5 decades later. The case files remain open, the forest keeps its secrets, and the question persists, cold and unanswerable as a February night in the mountains. What were they running from? There are forests that feel wrong, not dangerous in any quantifiable way, not threatening by any measure that reason can articulate, simply wrong. The trees grow at angles that shouldn't occur. The sounds don't carry the way physics says they should. Animals avoid certain clearings for no apparent reason. Compasses spin. Electronics fail. Visitors emerge with scratches they don't remember receiving, with hours unaccounted for, with a profound and persistent sense that something was watching them the entire time. The Hoia Baciu forest outside Cluj-Napoca, Romania, has earned the name the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania, and the comparison, while sensational, is not entirely unearned. This stretch of woodland, covering roughly 700 acres of rolling hills in the heart of Romania, has accumulated a reputation over the past half-century as one of the most consistently strange places on Earth. The phenomena reported here do not fit neatly into a single category. They span the spectrum from the merely unusual to the genuinely inexplicable. Visitors report sudden, overwhelming anxiety upon entering the tree line, not the ordinary unease of walking in an unfamiliar forest, but a visceral physical dread that rises without warning and vanishes just as suddenly when they leave. Some develop rashes, burns, or scratches on exposed skin with no apparent cause. Electronic devices malfunction with unusual frequency. Cameras refuse to focus, GPS units give nonsensical readings, watches stop. The trees themselves are perhaps the forest's most visible anomaly. Many of them grow in bizarre formations, spiraling trunks, zigzag patterns, branches that curve back on themselves in ways that no botanist has been able to explain through natural processes. The forest floor is littered with specimens that seem to have grown in defiance of phototropism, of gravity, of every force that should guide a tree towards sunlight and stability. Something in this soil, in this air, in whatever invisible field permeates this place, appears to affect growth patterns in ways that science cannot yet articulate. At the heart of the forest lies a clearing, a nearly perfect circle perhaps 200 meters in diameter where nothing grows. The grass that covers the surrounding land simply stops at an invisible boundary. Inside the circle, the soil is barren, packed hard, supporting no vegetation of any kind. Soil samples have been taken and analysed multiple times. No unusual chemical composition has been found. No toxins, no salination, no pH imbalance that might explain the sterility. The Earth simply refuses to support life in that precise circular area, as if some invisible dome of prohibition covers it. This clearing has become the focal point of the forest's mythology, and perhaps its reality as well. Locals have reported lights in and around it, glowing orbs, unexplained illuminations, flickering presences that seem to move with intention. In 1968, Emil Barnea, a military technician, photographed what he described as a metallic disc hovering above the clearing. The photograph has never been satisfactorily explained, and Barnea, who had no interest in publicity and faced professional consequences for coming forward, maintained until his death that he simply photographed what he saw. People have disappeared in this forest, not permanently in most cases, but temporarily. Visitors have entered the tree line and emerged hours later with no memory of where they had been, no sense that time had passed, no explanation for the gap between when they walked in and when they walked out. A 5-year-old girl reportedly vanished for 5 years before emerging from the forest, unchanged, unaged, wearing the same clothes with no memory of the intervening time. The story may be apocryphal, it has the structure of folklore, but it persists in local memory with the weight of truth. What is the Hoya Basu Forest? A geomagnetic anomaly affecting both compasses and consciousness. A thin place where the boundaries between dimensions or timelines grow permeable. A haunted wood, weighted with the psychic residue of events long forgotten. Or simply a forest that has accumulated a reputation, where visitors arrive already primed for strangeness, and find confirmation of their expectations in every twisted branch and unexplained headache. The phenomena continue regardless of explanation. The clearing remains barren. The trees continue to grow in their impossible spirals, and those who venture into the forest continue to return with stories they struggle to articulate, with photographs that show shapes they cannot identify, with scratches they do not remember receiving, and with a lingering sense that the forest was aware of their presence the entire time and was, perhaps, only barely tolerating their intrusion. The question of what can come through into our world takes a different form in a small village in Andalusia, in the south of Spain, where for over half a century faces have been appearing in the concrete floor of an ordinary house. Faces that no one put there. Faces that refuse to stay away no matter how many times they are destroyed and the floor is relaid. The story begins in August of 1971, in the village of Belmes de la Moraleda. Maria Gomez Camara was in her kitchen when she noticed something strange in the concrete floor. A discoloration, a pattern that seemed to resolve, the longer she looked at it, into features, eyes, a nose, a mouth turned down in sorrow or pain, a face, looking up at her from the floor. She scrubbed at it. The face remained. She told her husband, Juan Pereira, who examined it and shared her unease. They tried to remove it by ordinary means, but it persisted. Finally, Pereira took a pickaxe to the floor, breaking up the concrete and hauling away the debris. They laid fresh cement, waited for it to cure, and believed the matter to be settled. It was not settled. Within days, a new face began to appear in the fresh concrete, then another, and another. The faces multiplied, spreading across the floor of the kitchen like a gallery of portraits painted by an invisible hand. Men, women, children. Some wore expressions of calm, almost peaceful. Others seemed to be screaming. One appeared to be in the midst of violent death, its features twisted in agony. Word spread. Visitors arrived, first neighbours, then journalists, then investigators from universities and research institutions. The mayor of Belmes ordered an excavation beneath the kitchen floor, and what the workers found transformed a local curiosity into something far more disturbing. Beneath the concrete, buried and forgotten, lay human remains, bones dating back centuries, the remnants of a graveyard that predated the house, predated perhaps the modern village itself. The remains were exhumed, given proper burial elsewhere, but the faces continued to appear. If anything, they became more frequent, more varied, more insistent. Over the following decades, dozens of distinct faces manifested in the floor of that kitchen, some lasting for years, others appearing briefly and fading, new ones emerging as old ones slowly dissolved back into the featureless grey of the cement. Scientists studied the phenomenon with increasing intensity. Chemical analyses were conducted on the concrete itself, searching for pigments, dyes, or any substance that might have been deliberately applied. Some studies found trace amounts of unidentified compounds. Others found nothing at all. Controlled experiments were attempted, Sections of the floor were sealed and monitored, with no human access permitted. Faces appeared anyway. Skeptics proposed that the faces were the result of pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive faces in random patterns, combined perhaps with deliberate hoaxing by Maria Gomez Camara or her family. But pareidolia does not explain how new faces could appear in freshly poured concrete. It does not explain the correlation between the faces and the human remains discovered beneath. It does not explain the testimony of researchers who watched the patterns emerge over the course of days, with no intervention from anyone. Maria Gomez Camara lived in that house until her death in 2004, and in the years following, the faces continued to appear. The house is now a small museum, open to visitors who wish to see for themselves the phenomenon that has defied explanation for over 50 years. The faces are still there, some faded, some vivid, all silent, all unexplained, all staring upward from the floor with expressions that seem to carry messages we cannot quite read. What leaves its impression on the places where it passes? What memory does stone retain? What are we not being told by the surfaces that surround us, the walls and floors and foundations that we trust to be inert, to be merely material, to hold no record of what has transpired upon them? The faces of Belmez offer no answers. They only stare and wait and refuse to be erased. There are cases where the strangeness resides in a place, where the anomaly is fixed to geography and can be avoided simply by staying away. And there are cases where something moved through the world, something with agency and hunger, something that chose its victims with apparent deliberation and killed them with a savagery that no ordinary predator could explain. For 3 years in the remote Margeride Mountains of southern France, from 1764 to 1767, something killed. It killed women gathering firewood. It killed children tending livestock. It killed shepherds in the fields and travellers on the roads. It killed with such frequency and such ferocity that it became known throughout France as la bête du Gévaudan, the beast of Gévaudan, and its reign of terror drew the attention of King Louis XV himself. The first confirmed attack occurred in June of 1764, when a young woman was tending cattle near the forest of Mercois. She was found torn apart, her body mutilated in ways that suggested not a wolf attack, but something far more brutal. Over the following months, more bodies were found, most of them women and children, most of them killed in daylight, most of them partially devoured. The descriptions of the creature were remarkably consistent given the chaos of the attacks. Witnesses described an animal larger than any wolf, perhaps the size of a small horse. Its fur was reddish-brown, sometimes described as having a darker stripe running down its back. Its head was enormous, its jaws powerful beyond anything the peasants of Gévaudan had ever encountered. Its tail was long, almost lion-like, and it seemed to possess an intelligence, an ability to evade traps, to avoid hunters, to disappear when pursuit was mounted and reappear when the danger had passed. The attacks continued throughout 1764 and into 1765. The body count rose. Estimates range from 100 to over 300 dead, depending on which records one consults and how broadly one defines the geographical area affected. The killings followed no pattern that the authorities could discern. The beast struck where it wished, when it wished, and vanished before anyone could mount an effective response. King Louis XV had dispatched professional wolf hunters, the legendary Louvetiers of the crown, to end the menace. They arrived with hounds, with firearms, with all the expertise that generations of wolf extermination had granted them. They tracked, they hunted, they killed wolves. The attacks continued. They organised massive battues, drives involving hundreds of peasants, attempting to flush the beast from its hiding places. The attacks continued. In September of 1765, a royal hunter named François Antoine killed an enormous wolf in the forests of Chaise. The animal was paraded through the countryside, presented at court, declared to be the beast of Gévaudan. The king declared victory. The hunters returned to Paris, and then, 2 months later, the attacks resumed. For 2 more years, the beast continued to kill, not with the same frequency as before, but with the same inexplicable savagery. It was as if killing the wolf had accomplished nothing, as if the real beast had never been touched. In June of 1767, a local hunter named Jean Chastel killed an animal during a parish-organised hunt in the forest of Montmouchet. When the creature was opened, witnesses reported it contained human remains. The attacks stopped. The beast of Gévaudan was dead. But what was it? The animal Chastel killed was described variously as a wolf, a large dog, or something unknown. Its remains were paraded briefly before decomposing and being lost to history. No specimen, no skeleton, no preserved evidence survives for modern analysis. The naturalists of the time could not identify the species with certainty. Modern researchers, working from the written accounts and the detailed depositions taken during the investigation, have proposed hyenas, escaped exotic animals, or unusually large wolves. None of these explanations account for all the evidence. None explain the creature's apparent intelligence, its ability to select vulnerable victims, its consistent targeting of the face and throat, its seeming immunity to conventional hunting methods. The beast of Gévaudan killed more people than any predator in French history. Its identity remains unknown. And yet, even as we speak of identity, of what the beast was in taxonomic terms, we must acknowledge that the question itself may be incomplete. For the people of Gévaudan, the peasants who buried their children and barricaded their doors and prayed to saints, whose names have long since faded from common memory, the beast was never simply an animal. It was a judgment, a visitation, something that had emerged from the old darkness of the forest to remind humanity of its place in the natural order. The mountains of Margeride are quiet now. The wolves that once haunted those slopes were hunted to extinction in France by the 20th century, though they have begun to return in recent decades, crossing back from Italy and Spain. The villages that the beast terrorized still exist, some of them, at least, their stone walls weathered by centuries, their churches still holding the parish records that document, in faded ink, the names of the dead. And in those records, in those testimonies preserved in municipal archives and royal correspondence, one finds something that no natural explanation can fully address: the consistency of the fear. Hundreds of witnesses across 3 years, across dozens of attacks, describe the same creature in the same terms. Not a wolf, something else. Something that killed with purpose, that selected its victims, that seemed to understand when it was being hunted and how to evade. Something that, when finally killed, contained within its body the evidence of its crimes. The beast of Gévaudan is gone, but the forest remains, and the question remains: what walked out of those mountains 260 years ago, killed more than 100 people, and vanished from the world as suddenly as it had appeared? The answer, if there is one, lies buried somewhere in the soil of the Margeride, and the soil, as we have seen throughout this journey, keeps its secrets well. But now we turn from the forests of France to the farmlands of Kentucky, where on a hot August night in 1955, a family found themselves under siege, not by a creature of fur and fang, but by something that defied every category they knew. Something silver, something glowing, something that would not die. The Sutton farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt road near the small town of Kelly, Kentucky, 7 miles north of Hopkinsville. It was a modest structure, as rural Kentucky homes often were in those years. No running water, no telephone, a porch that looked out over fields of corn and tobacco. On the evening of August 21st, the extended Sutton family had gathered there. Elmer Sutton, his wife, his mother, several siblings and their spouses, and a visitor named Billy Ray Taylor who had come down from Pennsylvania. 11 adults and children in total, crowded into the small house on a night when the temperature had barely dropped below 80 degrees. At around 7 in the evening, Billy Ray Taylor stepped outside to draw water from the well. What he saw in the sky above the farm would set in motion one of the strangest nights in the history of American folklore. A bright object, not a plane, not a star, something luminous and moving with purpose, crossed the sky and appeared to descend into a ravine about a quarter-mile from the house. Taylor ran inside to tell the others. They laughed at him. No one believed in flying saucers in Kelly, Kentucky. An hour later, the dogs began barking. Elmer Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor grabbed their weapons, a 12-gauge shotgun and a .22 caliber rifle, and stepped onto the porch to investigate. What they saw standing at the edge of the property would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. It was small, perhaps 3 to 4 feet tall. Its skin appeared to be silver or metallic, and it seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. Its head was large and round, its eyes enormous and wide-set, reflecting the light from the farmhouse windows with an unnatural intensity. Its arms were long, too long, ending in hands that seemed to be tipped with talons, and it was approaching the house in a way that struck both men as deliberate, purposeful. Billy Ray Taylor raised the rifle and fired. He hit it. Both men swore later that they hit it at a range of no more than 20 feet. The creature did not fall. It did not bleed. It tumbled backward, flipping in a strange somersault, and then simply floated away into the darkness as if gravity held no claim on it. Before the men could process what had happened, another creature appeared at the window. For the next 3 hours, the Sutton family was under siege. Creatures appeared at windows, on the roof, in the trees around the property. When Elmer Sutton stepped outside to confront them directly, one of the beings reached down from the roof and touched his hair. Taylor fired directly upward and hit the creature at point-blank range. The sound, both men reported, was like bullets striking an empty metal bucket. The creature tumbled off the roof and floated to the ground, then simply walked away. Inside the house, the women and children huddled together, terrified. The creatures seemed capable of appearing anywhere, silhouetted in windows, scratching at walls, their enormous eyes reflecting the lamplight as they peered inside. And through it all, they made no sound. No communication, no vocalization, nothing that could be interpreted as speech or threat. They simply watched and approached and refused to die. At approximately 11 in the evening, the family could take no more. They piled into 2 cars and drove at reckless speed the 7 miles to the Hopkinsville police station. When they burst through the doors, the officers on duty saw something that immediately dispelled any notion that this was a prank or a delusion. The adults were visibly terrified, pale, shaking, some of them in tears. Their clothes were covered in dust and gunpowder residue. These were not people staging a hoax. These were people who had been through something. The police responded with significant force. State troopers were called. Military personnel from nearby Fort Campbell arrived. A convoy of vehicles descended on the Sutton farm, armed officers spreading out across the property with flashlights and weapons drawn. They found no creatures, but they found evidence of something. Bullet holes pocked the walls of the farmhouse. Shotgun shells littered the ground around the property. The screens on several windows had been damaged from the outside, torn in ways consistent with something attempting to force entry. And in the grass near the house, officers reported finding a strange luminescent patch, as if something had left behind a residue of its presence. The investigation continued through the night. 11 adults gave statements independently, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. The size of the creatures, their appearance, their apparent immunity to gunfire, the floating movement that defied physics. Skeptics have attempted to explain the encounter as misidentified owls, as a hoax, as mass hysteria. None of these explanations account for all the evidence. Owls do not glow. A hoax would not have produced the genuine terror that every officer who arrived at the scene reported observing. Mass hysteria does not leave bullet holes in walls. The Sutton family abandoned the farm shortly after the incident. They wanted nothing more to do with the property, nothing more to do with the attention that followed, nothing more to do with whatever had visited them that night. They maintained their account for the rest of their lives, never embellishing, never profiting, never wavering from the story they had told on that August night. What came to the Sutton farm in 1955? The military's official conclusion was that the family had encountered something, though they could not say what. The creatures were never identified. The luminescent residue, if it was ever analysed, produced no documented results. The case remains open in the files of Kentucky State Police, unexplained, unresolved, unrepeated. And in Kelly, Kentucky, the locals still tell the story. They hold a festival every year, a celebration of the night their small community became famous for one of the most extensively witnessed and investigated encounters with unknown beings in American history. They have embraced the mystery, perhaps because the alternative, that something truly inexplicable occurred there, that the boundary between what we understand and what we do not is thinner than we imagine, is too unsettling to hold at arm's length. The creatures, whatever they were, never returned. The night sky over Kelly still fills with stars on summer evenings, and somewhere in the darkness between those stars the questions remain. But questions in the darkness are not exclusively modern phenomena. Long before Kentucky farmers fired shotguns at glowing visitors, long before radar and radio and the apparatus of scientific investigation, there were events that defied explanation, witnessed by thousands, documented by contemporary authorities, and preserved in forms that allow us to examine them across the gulf of centuries. On April 14th, 1561, The citizens of Nuremberg, Germany, witnessed something that they could only describe as a battle in the sky. Dawn had just broken over the city when the phenomenon began. Witnesses reported seeing the sun first, as expected, rising in the east, but surrounding the sun and then spreading across the entire visible sky were objects, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, of shapes that no one could identify. Spheres of various colours, blue, black, blood red, cylindrical shapes that the witnesses described as tubes or cannons, crosses, crescent shapes, and all of them appeared to be moving with purpose, interacting with one another, engaged in what observers could only interpret as combat. For over an hour the spectacle continued. The objects moved across the sky in formations, approached one another, separated, collided. Some appeared to emit smoke. Some fell from the sky and crashed beyond the city walls, where they were reported to have burned on the ground. When the phenomenon finally ended, a large black spear-shaped object was observed hovering motionless for a time before it too disappeared. The event was documented not in rumour or oral tradition, but in a broadsheet printed and distributed within weeks of the occurrence. Hans Glaser, a respected woodcut artist of the time, created a detailed illustration based on the testimony of witnesses. The image survives in museum archives today, a clear morning sky filled with geometric shapes locked in aerial conflict above the spires of Nuremberg, while the citizens below point and watch in astonishment. The text accompanying the woodcut describes the event as a divine warning, a very frightful spectacle sent by God as a portent of coming troubles. This was the interpretive framework available to 16th century Germans. They had no concept of extraterrestrial visitors, no vocabulary for aerial vehicles, no way to process what they had seen, except through the lens of religious symbolism. And yet, beneath the theological interpretation, the underlying description is striking in its precision. Objects in the sky, geometric shapes, apparent motion and interaction, objects falling and burning upon impact. What did the citizens of Nuremberg witness that April morning? Modern explanations have proposed sundogs, atmospheric phenomena caused by ice crystals refracting sunlight, meteor showers, unusual cloud formations. Each of these explanations accounts for some portion of what was reported, but none account for all of it. Sundogs do not engage in combat. Meteors do not hover. Clouds do not take the form of perfect geometric shapes. The Nuremberg celestial phenomenon remains exactly what it was 5 centuries ago, an event witnessed by thousands of people, documented in contemporary media, and utterly unexplained. It is not the only such account from the period. A similar event was recorded over Basel, Switzerland, in 1566, complete with another woodcut illustration, showing black spheres filling the sky. But Nuremberg is the most detailed, the most thoroughly documented, and the most resistant to conventional explanation. Standing in the old city today, looking up at the same sky that filled with impossible objects more than 460 years ago, one cannot help but wonder, what did they see? And more unsettling still, has the same phenomenon been occurring throughout human history, interpreted according to the frameworks available in each era? Angels, demons, aerial battles, flying saucers, unexplained aerial phenomena. Different words, perhaps, for the same enduring mystery. The sky has always held secrets, and it appears those secrets have always been willing to reveal themselves, if only for a moment, before retreating once more into the realm of the unexplained. But the unexplained is not always found in the heavens. Sometimes it lies at sea level, in the shipping lanes of the Pacific, in distress calls received and answered too late to change what had already been set in motion. In June of 1947, a radio message was received in the Strait of Malacca from a Dutch freighter, the SS Orang Medan. The message was brief, garbled in places, but its content was unmistakable. All officers, including captain, are dead, the transmission stated, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. And then, after a pause, a final message: I die. Nearby vessels triangulated the signal and dispatched the Silver Star, an American merchant ship, to investigate. When the crew of the Silver Star boarded the Orang Medan hours later, they found exactly what the distress call had promised, and more. The entire crew was dead. The captain lay on the bridge, his body contorted. The radio operator was slumped at his post, hand still reaching toward the telegraph key. Officers were scattered across the chart room, frozen in attitudes of extreme distress. And throughout the ship, on the decks, in the holds, in the passageways, the bodies of the crew lay where they had fallen. There were no wounds, no signs of violence, no indication of what had killed them. But their faces told a story that no autopsy could capture. Every corpse, according to the testimony of the Silver Star's crew, wore an expression of absolute terror. Eyes wide open, mouths agape in silent screams, arms outstretched as if warding something off, something that had moved through the ship and taken every life aboard. The boarding party from the Silver Star began preparations to tow the vessel to the nearest port for investigation. They had barely returned to their own ship when smoke began rising from the Orang Medan's hold. Within minutes, the freighter was engulfed. Before anyone could respond, an explosion ripped through the vessel, and the Orang Medan sank beneath the surface of the strait, taking with it every piece of physical evidence that might have explained what had happened aboard. The story has been documented in newspaper accounts, in Lloyd's List, the authoritative record of maritime activity, and in testimonies from crew members of the Silver Star. And yet, when researchers have attempted to verify the Orang Medan's existence, they have encountered a troubling gap. No definitive registry of the vessel has been found in Dutch shipping records. No manifest of crew or cargo survives. The ship that transmitted that final desperate message, that was boarded and photographed and watched as it exploded, appears to have left no official trace of its existence. How is this possible? Theories abound. Some suggest the ship was carrying illicit cargo, perhaps chemical weapons or toxic materials being transported in violation of international agreements, and that its registry was deliberately erased to avoid implication. Others propose that the story itself is a fiction, an urban legend that somehow generated false documentary evidence. But the testimony of the Silver Star's crew is difficult to dismiss. They saw something. They boarded a ship full of dead men whose faces wore expressions of unimaginable fear. They watched that ship burn and sink. The Orang Medan may be a ghost ship in more than one sense, a vessel that sailed, killed its crew, and then vanished not only beneath the waves, but from the very records that should have documented its existence. It is a mystery wrapped in questions of evidence, of verification, of how we know what we know about events that left no survivors and almost no trace. The sea keeps its secrets well, and the Orang Medan, wherever it truly rests, has kept its secret for nearly 80 years. We have travelled far in these hours, from broadcast signals hijacked by masked intruders in Chicago to radio telescopes listening for messages from the stars, from silent lights drifting over Arizona deserts to children speaking in voices not their own, from villages emptied of their inhabitants with no explanation, to young men fleeing in terror from threats never identified, from forests where the trees grow wrong and faces emerge from concrete floors, to creatures in the dark that bullets could not kill. What binds these mysteries together is not their subject matter. They span the full range of human experience, from technology to the supernatural, from the depths of space to the depths of the human mind. What binds them is something simpler and more profound. They resist closure. They refuse to resolve into the comfortable categories we have constructed to make sense of our world. They sit at the boundary between the known and the unknown, reminding us that the boundary exists and that it is far closer than we like to believe. We speak of progress, of the march of human understanding, as though history moves in a single direction, from ignorance toward knowledge, from darkness toward light. And in many ways it does. We understand things today that our ancestors could never have imagined. We have walked on the moon. We have mapped the human genome. We have sent our voices and our faces across the planet at the speed of light. And yet, for all our progress, we have not explained what spoke through Janet Hodgson in that Enfield council house. We have not identified what killed the beast of Gévaudan, or what the beast actually was. We have not found the source of the wow, signal, or determined why it has never repeated. We have not identified the figure behind the Max Headroom mask. Despite having the technology to track our every digital footprint, we have not explained why the trees in Hoya Baciu grow in spirals, or why faces continue to appear in the floors of a Spanish village, or why 5 men drove 70 miles into the wrong mountains and apparently chose to die rather than face whatever had frightened them. These are not failures of science. They are reminders of the limits of knowing. limits that no amount of technology or methodology can eliminate entirely. We are finite creatures, observing an infinite universe with instruments calibrated to detect only certain frequencies, certain wavelengths, certain forms of evidence. What lies outside those frequencies remains invisible to us, even when its effects manifest in ways we cannot ignore. The farmer in Kentucky knew his farm. He knew the weight of a shotgun in his hands and the sound a bullet makes when it hits flesh. When his bullet hit something that sounded like metal, and the creature simply walked away, his understanding of reality cracked. Not because he was ignorant, but because what he witnessed fell outside the boundaries of what his knowledge could explain. The astronomer in Ohio knew the mathematics of radio signals, the physics of stellar radiation, the profiles of known cosmic phenomena. When 72 seconds of signal came through his receiver, with a profile that matched nothing natural and everything intelligent, his understanding of our place in the universe shifted, not because he was mistaken, but because what he detected suggested something that science could not yet accommodate. The officer who walked through the Sutton farm at midnight knew what evidence looked like. The terror on the faces of 11 witnesses, the bullet holes in the walls, the shells scattered across the yard. He knew these things were real. What he could not know was what had caused them. This is where we find ourselves, at the end of this long night of mysteries. Not with answers, but with questions that have proven themselves more durable than any explanation offered. Not with certainty, but with the humility that comes from recognizing how much remains beyond our grasp. The masked figure on that Chicago television screen in 1987 wanted us to see something absurd, something transgressive, something that broke the smooth surface of normal broadcasting. Whoever they were, they succeeded beyond any measure they could have imagined. 40 years later, we are still watching, still wondering, still unable to look away from the static-laced face that grinned at us from the other side of the screen. Perhaps that is the lesson embedded in all these mysteries. Not the specific details of haunted houses or signal intrusions or celestial phenomena, but the fact of the mystery itself. The recognition that we live in a world that is not fully mapped, not fully understood, not fully under our control, that the darkness at the edge of the campfire light contains things we have not named, that the signals we receive from space may be asking questions we cannot yet pass, that the forests and mountains and oceans of our own planet harbour secrets that predate us and will outlast us. We are surrounded by mystery. It presses against the walls of our knowing like water against a dam, and sometimes, in moments of intrusion, it breaks through. The signal appears on a printout in Ohio. The face appears on a floor in Spain. The lights appear over Arizona. The voice speaks through a child in London. The creature appears at a window in Kentucky. The ship sends its final message and sinks without a trace. These are the moments when the membrane thins, when the ordinary world reveals itself to be less solid, less certain, less knowable than we had imagined. We can dismiss these moments, file them away as anomalies, as errors, as hoaxes, or we can hold them gently, turning them over in our minds like stones from a foreign shore, acknowledging that they do not fit our existing collection but are real nonetheless. The night is long, and the mysteries are many. Some of them will be solved, perhaps, as technology advances and new tools become available. Some will remain forever open, questions that outlive the generations who ask them. But perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be accepted. A fundamental feature of existence that reminds us we are not the final authorities, not the last word, not the complete explanation of ourselves or our world. The stars above us burn with ancient light. The earth beneath us holds secrets in its stone. The air around us carries signals we cannot hear, from sources we cannot identify, speaking messages we cannot yet decode. We are listeners at the edge of knowing, watching the darkness for shapes we cannot name, and the darkness, it seems, is watching back.